I'm very, very happy to be here and to moderate this session. So before we start, I think that one of the interesting things here is that all of us are sitting in different spaces, and all of us are having a conversation as though we are in the same space. And even 15, 20 years ago, that would have been considered very, very futuristic. And although the technology existed, yet somebody thought of it, somebody implemented it. Okay, there was a tremendous amount of science, technology, patents, and all of that that has gone in to make this happen. And there are so many things that we think about today that may not exist today, but would probably be very, very matter of course for somebody who lived 100 years from now. And I think that in very many ways is the beauty of science. I wonder what science would have been like if 100 years ago or 150 years ago, Jules Verne did not think of the submarine. I wonder what would have happened if Charles Darwin did not write The Origin of Species. I wonder what would have happened if a whole generation did not see Cosmos. Okay, I wonder what would have happened if a whole generation did not watch Star Trek. I'm mixing up here fiction and non-fiction, but in the stream of consciousness, in the stream of the way we think, interact with ideas, interact with things. The written word, the seen word, the idea, the power of imagination is so very strong. And I think that's one of the reasons why we need to talk about science books, and how do you popularize science to a larger audience. And today there's a fantastic panel here who is going to discuss this and help us make sense of all of this. Let's start with Professor K. Vijay Raghavan, who is a distinguished scientist, a former principal scientific advisor to the government of India, and somebody who has driven science communication. I worked with him when he was the PSA, and his passion for communicating science across languages, across a socioeconomic segment, across learning, across degrees was fabulous. He is a member of the Indian Academy of Science, the US National Academy of Science, and the Royal Society. A biologist by training, he has made significant contributions not just to this broad area which we call biology, but also to the remaining sciences, both as a scientist and as a science administrator. He's been a passionate advocate for science writing. In fact, one of the things he told us is, why don't you create cartoons around science? They will help us communicate science better. And he believes that it's essential for communicating science ideas to the public. Angela Saini is somebody whose work I found fascinating. I've read both Inferior, which talks about how science has gotten women wrong, and Superior, about this very, very dangerous area of science of race. And I would highly recommend both books to all of you who like reading. And she's going to be here talking about the need for science journalism as well as science books. And Professor Seth is a specialist in an area that I have recently gotten to, which is consciousness. For me, consciousness was always a part of spirituality. And suddenly I'm realizing it's far more than that. There is an entire science to that. And it's fascinating to see spirituality and science coming together in the form of writings, in the form of books, and so on. So without much ado, what I would do is I would start and ask each of them to give a 2-line introduction about what they're going to talk about and how they find science communication to be fascinating, and then we'll begin the conversation. Does that work? Let's start with Angela.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you so much for having me, first of all, and to everyone who's tuning in now. It's actually very early where I am. I live in New York, but I wish the time difference wasn't so long, and I wish I could have been there in person. For me, I came to science journalism a little bit later. So even though I studied engineering at university, I became a journalist immediately afterwards. I went to work in TV news for a while, and I was covering everything: politics, crime. I was doing investigations. And when I came back to science writing, what I wanted to do was bring that same journalistic sensibility to science writing. So I'm most fascinated in how we live, the reasons for inequality in society, how we imagine human difference. And I do that through investigations. I try to understand why scientists research what they research, why they think what they think, the kind of sometimes the dark underbelly behind research, the funding, the personal motivations, the politics, and there is a great deal of politics inside science. I think sometimes we overlook that because we treat science as though this is some endeavor that exists outside society, that it's, beyond everyday life and better than politics. But it's human and it's messy, and it's that human messiness that I really love to understand, not least because this is also an establishment of power. Scientists and the scientific establishments have a huge role to play in how we understand ourselves, how we draw divisions within society, how we conceive of what is possible and what isn't possible in terms of how we live. So I really think in that sense, as a journalist, I treat it as a system of power in the same way that a business reporter would treat business as something to be interrogated, and a political journalist would treat politics as something to be interrogated.
Thank you, Angela. Professor Vijay Raghavan.
Yes, thank you very much, Harini. First of all, I should say I'm sort of in awe of the company here. You're right, I sort of have been trying to propound science communication, but haven't done anything at all about it personally in any significant manner, really. And, our colleagues here, Angela and Anil, have done really fantastic work, which you've briefly mentioned. Now, my perspective being in India is the following. There are two independent points. One is if you go on social media, the social media kind, not the anti-social media kind, and you look around and you really are exposed to wonderful science writing and science communication. And you have newspapers, magazines, books, and it's really something which you can lap it up. Now, sadly, this is substantially for people like us, available to those who are connected to the English-speaking world, or in Europe to European languages, for example. And the Indian language community, the intellectual community even, is disconnected with quality science writing. There's a thriving literature in Indian languages. There's thriving debate in Indian languages, art, music, drama, but science and science writing is notable by its minimal level. So how can we change that? How can we get quality translations available on a wide scale? So that's number one. Conversely, science writing from India, again, there are some very nice, significant writing which has come out in the recent past, and there have been some earlier ones also. They are substantially or usually in English. Could we stimulate, and those also, by the way, are also substantially about broader science topics of concern to the world in general, and very few of them are rooted in or inspired by Indian context. And there's so much exciting things to write about from Indian context. So both these things, I think we need to push. More science writing from India in Indian languages and in English, and translation of the best science in the world into Indian languages. Thank you.
And Dr. Seth.
Likewise, thank you for inviting me into this panel. It's super interesting already. So I'm still a scientist and a science writer, which is, I think, the tricky balance to strike. So I'm a neuroscientist, but have a wide background in physics and psychology and artificial intelligence and various things. And my main interest is in understanding consciousness and how we experience the world and the self. And of course, you can make a good argument that books and literature have always been the best way to understand what it is to be a human self, not necessarily neuroscience, but I think they're all part of the same thing. Now, for me, growing up in the UK, I was very inspired at an early age when I was an undergraduate by some of the popular science writing I encountered, things like Richard Dawkins' Selfish Gene and Daniel Dennett's Consciousness Explained. And these are books I still come back to. And I think that, they're massively influential in just shaping the aspirations of a new generation of people, myself included. And then for a while, I just pursued the line of let's try and get a successful career in science, which is, as we all know, is not that easy. But the more I did that, the more I was frustrated by how writing within science takes place. You write academic articles, you write book chapters. They're very formulaic. They're often really dull to read and even duller to write. And so I had this motivation to try and communicate some of the interest, but also the substance of what I was doing in my research and what I was seeing in the research around me in a way that was accessible, while still maintaining my day job as a scientist, which I still do. So for me, it's a sort of smaller thing. And I found, to start with, I also did a lot of public speaking, and I think the two things really help each other, because if you write accessibly, it's almost as if you're speaking to somebody. So the two activities complement. And for me, it really began by writing short articles for magazines, New Scientist, newspapers like The Guardian in the UK, and then sort of going on from there, ultimately to write a couple of books. Last one came out quite recently. And I think, there's many things that I found interesting about this. So one of them is that it's really helped me as a scientist to do this kind of writing for a more general public, because until you can explain something to somebody outside your immediate circle, you probably don't understand it very well yourself. So there's a certain clarity that you have to reach in public science writing that helps me understand, and it also helps me write my scientific papers, I think, a bit better. It makes them a little bit less dry, a little bit more interpretable than they might otherwise be. There's also, it's a two-way thing. I think by writing for a wider audience, I've learned an enormous amount by the conversations it's opened up, by the feedback that's come back, by the opportunities for engagement that it's raised. So it's been a very important part of my career. The challenge, I think, is that even in the UK, which is relatively friendly to popular science writing, people read the books, they get featured, people can write in the newspaper about them. It's very difficult to find a way to actually get going with it. Where do you start? How do you carve out the time? How do you get the advice? How do you get the feedback? And I've been lucky to have mentors at various stages that have helped. And so that's something I think would be lovely to discuss with the panel and with the audience.
So let me start with the first question, or the first point of discussion. We live in a world with multiple streams coming at us, consciousness, so as to speak. Okay, there is OTT, there is the metaverse, there is audio, there are games, there is TV, there is superheroes, there are comics, and so on and so forth. In such a world with so many streams, okay, what is the role of writing, science writing in particular? And I also ask this because it seems like we have gone from a world of enlightenment, which was the 70s and the 80s, in terms of science as seen as good, to being to kind of going into a world of literally bad science. Masking is bad. Okay, vaccines cost. Vaccine make you into transmitters of 5G, and really speaking, extremely poorly thought through. The world is flat. I mean, I love that one. I absolutely love that one. The world is flat and stuff like that. So in such a world, how do you look at science writing, and how do you make it popular? And in a country like India, which is multilingual, extremely diverse, with all access to all kinds of entertainment and various technologies, how do you make this work here, or in any case, in any country? Let's start with Professor Vijay Raghavan, because he's worn the policy hat, and he kind of drove the policy hat at the height of COVID, which means that he had to kind of combat a fair amount of fake. You're on mute, sir.
Sorry. There are multiple kinds of contexts which are present in societies around us. And the point is that when we talk in a panel like this, we can examine all of those. But then there's another side where, as a writer of a newspaper article, or a scholarly work, or a book for lay people, you hunker down, get down into specific details, and write what you are an expert on. So there are these whole different ranges. Now, public in general is, of course, exposed to a whole lot of stuff. Good, bad, ugly, nauseating, fake, true, the whole works. And this has amplified enormously. The whole volume of all kinds has amplified enormously in the last decade or so. And the spectrum of fake news occupies more space than legitimate news of various kinds. So this has actually, in some ways, made all the more valuable scholarly writing in long form, which has a staying power on a timeline much longer than the flash of the day. And therefore, that's so very valuable that we cannot underestimate that. It's so easy to get caught in the din of the moment, get caught into an argument on Twitter about what is right, what is wrong, and try to you get caught in dealing with extreme views of all kinds. That has its place as a social ferment, but really there's a great value in scholarly works, which is, I think, we should not forget about it. And print work, or even Kindle kind of writings accessible in all languages is very, very important.
Angela, with both your books, with both Inferior and Superior, how did you find the feedback? How did you find audience responses and reactions, and also media responses and reactions? And did people change their mind about views that they held?
Well, I've actually written 4 books. So my first
Yes.
book about science in India, Geek Nation, and that was a book specifically written for what at that time, this is more than 10 years ago, was seen to be a very booming publishing market in India. All the Western publishers had opened offices for the first time in India and were desperate to tap this huge reading market, which they thought would be the next big thing. And it didn't quite turn out that way, even though the Geek Nation did do very well. It was a bestseller in India, but I think the issue is that every single, my work has been translated into many different languages, although interestingly, no Indian languages. So all my books in India have been in English. I would love to see Indian language translations of my work. But every place that I go to where a new edition comes out, they have a different way of, the readers are very different. They have a different way of consuming. They have a different thing that they want from science writing. So in the US, for instance, because it's such a huge country, there is a very diverse set of interests, and it means that you can write about just about anything in any style, and there will be some niche audience somewhere within this country who will be a market for it. In the UK, I find that there's 2 main types of science books. There's the journalistic kind, like I write, which are written in the journalistic style of Britain, which is a very particular style. It's not very wordy, it's quite spare. It's kind of like Orwell used to write. And then there is the big explainer books, which scientists tend to write, which explain a form of science, and some it can be very beautiful, as Anil was saying, like Dawkins, he is the master of that genre, really beautifully written works that fully explain the science to the lay reader. And I think in India, there is an appetite for much more detail. I find that audiences in India love to have lots of facts and figures in their science writing. They love to really dive deep into subjects. But again, it's a very huge country, so there is such a diversity of appetites for work out there. I mean, the best-selling books in India still tend to be the ones that help you with your exams. Those books teach you, how to pass your exams. And there is, I think, in a sense, probably a space for science writers to enter that world, because those books can be quite dry. But if there is a way to access those students who are fascinated by these topics, but at the moment are reading mainly what can be quite dry textbooks, I think perhaps there is a bridge there between the kind of more accessible science writing that you get outside India and the very detailed, fact-based, kind of communication-driven writing that you get that is very popular inside India.
Thank you for that. And Dr. Seth, what do you think? How do you think science writing will work in a modern age?
Well, firstly, I'm very encouraged actually by what Angela just said, because I guess my own book is in the tradition of, as writing as a scientist. It's a bit more trying to trying to, I had to really walk this line of, I wanted to write a book that, in a sense, only I could have written, because it's sort of based on my own research over the last 20 years. So there was always this fight with my editors, like, no, that's too detailed, take that out, that you'll lose people there. Again, another classic popular science book, Stephen Hawking's A Brief History of Time, famously said, every equation you put in will halve your readership. And so there's this constant battle to, like, no, I need to have this in, and without having everything in footnotes and endnotes. So this is encouraging. If the audience in India indeed prefer a little bit more detail, then wonderful. I'm very naive to the nature of the Indian audience, although I have family in India. I think my book is available there, being you, but I don't know how well it's doing, or it would just be the English edition anyway. That's available there, the one that was published here. But just to return to your original point about the role of science writing today, I just think it's, given what you said about the hubbub of social media, the echo chambers we get into, the confusion that can be sparked by the short soundbite takes on science that we get. For me, it just emphasizes the importance now, more than ever. There's a need for clear accounts of what's actually going on, whether it's to do with vaccines and COVID, whether it's to do with currently, I've been writing about the astounding acceleration and capability of artificial intelligence. In all of these cases, there's a lot of hype and hubris, but there's also some underlying issues which are real and which need to be discussed sensibly, and also discussed without being politicized, and of course we all have a political view. We can't completely abstract it complete away, but to try to just clarify and communicate in a way that is not going to be within the confines of a tweet thread, but that is going to be, it just hits that middle ground between having to trawl through loads of papers and just seeing what's on social media. I mean, one of the things that really struck me, especially during the height of the pandemic, was this sort of idea, like, go and do your own research, that people were being sort of encouraged to do. And of course, that, it sounds nice, but it's, how do you do that? I mean, you can find research papers basically to support any particular point of view that you might have. And doing research is not just finding a paper that supports your view. And of course, most of them are incomprehensible anyway. So there's a real need for this middle ground, this interface, to make sure that society as a whole has accessible, not uniform, but accessible points of view about issues that are of concern right now. And that's above and beyond just this other thing about inspiration, inspiring new people to come into the science, to do, to pursue careers they might not otherwise have done. Because again, for me, I didn't really think that this would be an option until I started reading some of these popular science books. And that's when I first thought, oh, maybe this would be maybe this is what I want to do with my life.
So I'm so glad you brought up the topic of popular science as opposed to serious science, or the books with lots and lots of formulae that lose you half the audience every time you put in a formula. So when you're talking about popular science, what are the major challenges do you think that authors and then publishers face? Let's look at it from the author perspective, because none of us here is a publisher, but what would be the main challenge that you would face, Dr. Seth?
So the main challenge, so just from my own personal experience, that the main challenge was to try to figure out how to achieve this balance between detail and novelty, and accessibility and engagement. How to bring your reader along. Also, how to balance the kind of more explanatory elements of the book, like, we know this about the brain has so many neurons, all this, this is this theory, with the more personal. And that for me was a personal challenge in writing, because again, in writing academically, we tend to take the author out of it as much as possible. Mm-hmm. Ideally, you shouldn't sort of, I mean, of course, we like papers with a particular style, but that's not how you're taught to write a scientific paper. So for me, it was a challenge. How do I put myself back into it in a way that is compatible with what I'm trying to say, but that might help, keep readers with me for the ride. But it's really finding that detail, and of course then thinking from the perspective of the reader too, because the other challenge I had is I'm very familiar with my own material.
Yeah.
And here's maybe an interesting contrast with Angela and other science writers who may treat many different areas and be able perhaps to see that area from a slightly more objective point of view. The hard thing for me was getting out of my own bubble to sort of try and understand what other people would already know, or what they would find interesting or graspable onto about what I do. When you're deep in it, it's really hard to see it from an outside perspective.
And Angela, how about you? I mean, you write in a journalistic style, and across all your 4 books, what were the challenges that you faced as an author when it came to talking to publishers, or even to people who did not understand the area that you were writing about, except in the most general terms? And this will be of very great use to the people who are going to be pitching their abstracts here.
Well, the challenge is less for me because I write as a journalist, like you say, it's reportage. So it's a lot of interviews, a lot of first-hand observation. I do most of my work. I mean, the big glitch was COVID. It was very difficult with my last book, which just came out because it was difficult to travel as much as I would normally. So I had to do some interviews remotely, but generally I do everything in person. So I make lots of observations, and that brings color and interest to the material. And as Anil said, I do write from a distance. These are subjects often that I don't know very much about before I start writing them. So I'm taking that reader on a journey with me through that. And there is a difference. If you know a subject really well and you're writing about it, of course, the difficulty is, how do I get into the mind of somebody who doesn't know anything about it at all, who is starting from zero? Whereas for me, I'm already starting from zero. So the reader is coming alongside. But I would say that, follow your own style. I think everybody has their own particular way of writing, and don't be afraid of that, because we're in a world now in which the publishing industry has become so fragmented. And like I said, there are audiences for every single type of writing. There are some people who like it to be very simple, who don't like it to be flowery, who don't like their writing to be particularly detailed. But there are some people who love that, who just love the formulae and the footnotes and all the little facts and figures all the way through. They thrive on that. I have friends, I run a book club, and I have friends who prefer that kind of book to the very simple one. So if that's your style, just work with it, because there will be an audience for you out there.
Interesting. And Professor Vijay Raghavan, what do you think would be the challenges for writers in India writing science books? And I ask this specifically because unlike the US, unlike the UK, there doesn't seem to be an entire tradition of science writing in India, at least in the last 50 years.
By the way, call me Vijay. There is a tradition. Many people have written really high quality books about science. One, for example, is D.D. Kosambi on Indian science history, on Indian civilizations and a scientific analysis of their trade and so on. So there have been since then several. It is unfortunately sporadic and not a large school of science writers. Recently there have been books on Indian ecology, on migration of human populations, and these are all scholarly works. So what we need to move from is inspired individuals battling odds and writing books from that situation to something which becomes, has a certain momentum and has a trend. There are people writing about chemistry, about astronomy, about ecology, and so on a much larger scale. Now, the problem is all very well to say that needs to be done. It's not that there are not people who don't understand these areas. There are many who do. The challenge is, in a market such as India, who do you write for? Do you write for an international audience, in which case you had to compete internationally? And many Indian writers in English, fiction writers, have done a tremendous job over there. but science writers need to also get into that momentum. It's feasible, it's doable. But there are also other areas for science writing which no one else in the world can write quality work. And Indian writers need to get into that. And that's an enormous opportunity, both for an Indian market and a global market. So I think the opportunities are many. The Fast Book Award is a very good way of stimulating it. But our academic institutions and our journalism environments both need to welcome and stimulate science writing. And I think that can happen. By the way, science journalism has improved dramatically over the last few years. And so that can serve, from Angela's perspective, a way by which science book writing can also ramp up.
I think one of the major challenges, and this is something that when I teach in this space comes through, is that how do you make it accessible and interesting to a large audience, and yet at the same time keep it scientifically accurate, especially when it comes to things like analogies, because you try and give analogies that are relatable, and yet analogies might end up messing up the science part of it. Dr. Seth, let me start with you on this, because your area probably, so let's start with you on this.
Yeah, this is a good point. It is again a little bit of a variation on this idea of detail versus accessibility, and in particular, some of the devices we might use, like analogies, can be tricky. No analogy is perfect, and I've relied on several, and I think they're invaluable. I think you have to use them because there's such a powerful way of communicating an idea. And I'll give you one example. In my book, I talk about perception, how we perceive the world around us, as a kind of controlled hallucination. And it's not a new metaphor. It's not something that's been around. It's been not much talked about, but it goes back 100 years or so. And I found this a very powerful metaphor because it really sort of conveys the idea that what we experience, even though it seems like it comes just passively from the outside world, sort of as if the world just pours itself into our minds, and it's there independently of our perception. That's not what's going on. Our brains are actively generating our experience all the time. So this idea of hallucination, but it being controlled, is I think quite helpful. But of course, as soon as you simplify it down to those two words, even if you expand them a bit, you open up a lot of space for confusion about, do you mean that everything is made up, and are we, and is it all just in our minds, and you saying we're all mad? I think things like that, it can be very difficult, because what you're really relying on is your readers not to treat the analogy as a soundbite in and of itself, but to sort of read it and then go with you as you use it and sort of cash it out in various ways. So I think they're still necessary. I've used a lot of them.
I hear you, because I think that very often what we tend to do is to take words like controlled hallucination literally. It's like the term which I think that was used by the government during COVID, which was the vaccine is like a suraksha kavach. And that, I remember the kind of outrage generated on those two words, which is literally a security. What would a suraksha kavach be? It's a security amulet as such. And the idea of being anti-science came down extremely, was propagated extremely heavily at that point of time. Angela, how about you? How do analogies work in your area?
Well, I'm quite literal in my work, so I don't, when it's very rare that I have to do big, long science explainers because of the kind of area that I work in. But I would say that you can afford to be very broad in what you think of as science, especially in a country like India, which has a very long history of science and technology, one that goes back much further than most other countries in the world. So, for example, when I was first starting out as a science writer, one of my favorite writers was P. Senath. And you might think, well, that's not really science, but it is in a way, because agriculture is science. That also involves thinking about the world and how it works. And in that context, of course, India is still a country of small-scale farmers for whom this is a hugely important issue. This is one of the big science stories of the country. So there is no, there is a real value in looking at agricultural sciences, at plant sciences, and also at the kind of borderland areas in science which aren't entertained in other territories. So, for example, people like Vandana Shiva, whose work I don't generally agree with that much, but she really does push the boundaries of how we think about science and what it means, and spirituality and our relationship with the land, which is actually a very burgeoning area of science writing. I just interviewed an author recently who is in America, an indigenous scientist in America, writing about her indigenous traditions and how that has informed her work as a scientist and her relationship with the natural world. And there is a huge scope, I think, for that in countries outside the West, including in India. And then biography and memoir. There is, people love that. And I love to read biography and memoir of not just famous scientists, but people who have really come up in non-traditional ways into becoming engineers and scientists. And I'm thinking particularly here of William Kwamba's The Boy Who Harnessed the Wind, which is a beautiful book that just describes the pain and suffering that his family felt and how he became an engineer in order to fix that, in order to bring them out of that horrifying situation, and his journey through all of that. So what I would love to see, and what I don't think there's enough of, is that kind of grassroots science writing, the real experience of being a scientist or an engineer in an environment in which the odds are against you.
Thank you for that. And actually, it brings me on to the question I want to ask Vijay, which is this, that it's what Angela speaks about, which is the fact that a lot of countries which are not Western, which is practically the rest of the world, is not evidence-based science. It's far more traditional. So I'll give you an example of the Chinese Nobel Prize winner of medicine, I think in 2015, To Yu, who says that she found her cure when she looked through her grandmother's books, and she figured out there was a Chinese traditional method of kind of solving that problem around, I think, if I'm not mistaken, it's malaria. And she uses that, and she goes on to win the Nobel. Now, the thing is this, that there's a lot of tradition of healing, of cures, of things that are not proven, okay, by evidence-based science in a place like India. Is there a scope for books like that, which, without it going into mumbo jumbo? And I mean that quite seriously, because there's also a lot of the other stuff. Then I touched the stone and I got cured kind of stuff. But there's also a lot of extremely rigorous practices that exist that literally solve problems. I mean, for example, my brother had a spinal disorder, and Ayurveda literally cured him. It's quite unbelievable that in 6 months he was clambering up drain pipes when he was told by Western practitioners that you need to have an operation of the spine and you will probably live in pain all your life. So you do have rigor-based areas, but they are not evidence-based science the way we say science. There's a scope for books like that. You're on mute, sir.
Sorry, there's a lot to unpack in what you said, so I'll keep that aside for a longer discussion since we're running out of time. But point out that, when the Dutch colonized Malabar, Van Reed, the governor of Dutch Malabar, collaborated with the local Vaidyas and wrote a 12-volume book, the Hortus Malabaricus, pre-Linnaeus, in Latin, which was translated much recently in the 60s by Manilal, and it documented every single medicinal plant in the Malabar coast and the effect they had on various kinds of treatments. A very large number of those, the active ingredients have been taken and been used and so on, and there's been an incredible documentation. And it was, by the way, a collaborative effort, because the local Vaidyas and Itti Achyutan, who was acknowledged as essentially as a co-author, this was done, and this was hundreds of years ago. So there are examples, of course, of evidence-based science coming out of traditional wisdom, and that will continue to happen. But I do like the idea of contrasting evidence-based versus traditional as if they stand in contrast. And so there is, I mean, science has to be evidence-based, of whatever source it comes from. And that's a matter which one can do. So I would just summarize this by just making a simple statement from the point of view of science writing. You either write about areas which are local and which are of global interest, and you have to be expert in that. The Hortus Malabaricus is an example, right? And you can do a great job of that. Or you write about something which is of global interest and you do a great job. It might be currently Western. It might be about gravitational waves, about relativity, but you had better write a great job. So I don't think really reasonable in today's world, in the 21st century, to look at Western science and Eastern science. There is a scientific approach which is rigorous, and that can be used to examine both tradition and current ways of doing science. And by the way, as far as mumbo jumbo goes, there's no shortage of mumbo jumbo in the way the so-called evidence-based science is conducted, as also in traditional science. So that there is no proprietary component over there.
Fantastic. So I think that what it is given, what you have said has given us the limit parameters of how we would be judging abstracts coming in, which means that we are looking very, very clearly at evidence-based content. It can't be something that is a flight of fancy. It has to be backed, whether it's in the traditional mode or whether it has to be backed by evidence. Am I right in that? Fantastic. Any other questions, Abhila? Do we have more time? Do we have more time?
Why are Angela and Anil frozen?
Yeah,
maybe it's just my screen.
Take 5 more minutes to discuss.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Are there any questions from the audience that you want us to take? Okay, then I'll ask the last question, which is this. Sorry, sir, you had a point.
Well, my question to both Angela and Anil is, how do you do it? Do you get up in the morning and write for 3 hours every day, or do you work late at night, or do you do both? Do you agonize and do it in short spells, or are you consistent over a long period?
Yeah. Well, this is just my 9 to 5. So this is what I do for a living. So I just get up and I do it the same as any other job. But I know it's different if you have something else and then you write in your extra time. That can be a challenge.
Yeah, I must admit, I found it a real struggle, and it's trying to fit it in. Writing a book in your spare time is not a great task to set yourself, but it is possible. And so my strategy was to basically not write a book for years, because I thought I can't do it. And then eventually, you reach the point where, okay, the time has come. I knew I wanted to, so time has come now, and it was a kind of recognition that, okay, even small amounts add up over time. So, I'm kind of in awe of authors who write a book a year, and they can go from having the idea to the finish. Mine took me, I started in 2016 and published it in 2021. It took a long time. And over a year and a half of that, I did absolutely nothing on it. I just started it and put the title, which of course changed, and then nothing happened. But it was then this recognition that, okay, how much, what is a book? It's like literally how many words? Well, it doesn't be too long. I was a bit worried. I saw earlier in the chat, minimum length, 50,000. And one of the challenges in writing a book is to keep it short, not make it long. So, I thought I'm aiming for around 70,000 words. If I write 1,000 words a week, then in a year and a bit, I should have a first draft. And of course, some weeks you write a bit more, some weeks you don't write anything at all. Maybe that's for a couple of weeks. But I think just trying to do it, I did try and set some regular times, but it never really worked. I did take a few vacations where I was just writing instead of relaxing. But eventually, bit by bit, it comes together. I think the strategy is different if you're writing short pieces. And here the big difference between writing a scientific paper is often the deadline is, it doesn't, these things take ages, then they get reviewed, and that takes ages. So the sort of time from starting a project to publishing an academic paper can be years. And so when I first started writing for sort of outlets like New Scientist and Guardian, I was flabbergasted. They said, "Yeah, would you like to write this? And can we have it by 5 o'clock?" You're kidding me. No, but that's how it works. And so actually forcing myself to be able to say, okay, I'm just going to clear the afternoon and I'm going to write like 1,000 words on something and that will be finished. That's been a challenge for me too, because it's a very different way of writing, but it's possible with practice.
I think that the last question I would like to ask you is this, that when you choose a topic, okay, when you choose a topic to write about, how do you go about it? Angela, let me start with you because you have written 4 books in probably different areas, and they're very, very interesting areas. So how do you choose a topic?
I think there were also some questions from the audience, if you're happy to take those.
Yes, I'll take them as soon as this question is done, because it's also something that they will be pondering about.
Okay. Well, for me, it happens very slowly. So it usually takes me more than a year to write a book proposal, in between doing other things. But you know, you have the kernel of an idea and it percolates over years sometimes. And often my next book idea will come from my previous book or one of my previous books. And it's just, you know, a little thing. And then you notice things that you've read or what's happening in the news or stuff that's happening around you. And that kind of feeds into it. And gradually over time, what starts as a kernel of an idea, you think, oh, okay, this could actually be something more substantial. It's not just a magazine piece. It's not just a news report or a documentary. This is of book length. And in that process, of course, hundreds of other ideas go by the wayside. You know that they won't work so well. And then there are books that other people want you to write. So at the moment, my editor wants me to write a particular book that I know I don't want to write, that just won't work for me. And you have to really stick with what you care about, because you have to invest so much of your time and yourself in it. Especially my previous book, Superior, was incredibly important to me because it was the reason I got into journalism in the first place, was to cover issues of race and racism. So that was, there wasn't a force in the world that could have stopped me from writing that book. And I didn't care whether anyone read it or not, because I was just so committed to writing it. So I would say that, you know, sit with an idea for a long time, don't rush it. Let it kind of percolate until you feel that it's something substantial, and feel passion for it. The very first piece of advice I was ever given by an editor, it was I was doing an internship when I was a student at New Internationalist magazine, and the editor, who sadly has passed away since then, said to me, as long as you have the passion, then you have the talent. And I think that's a really good piece of advice, because the people who care the most, I think, do the best writing.
Fantastic. Dr. Seth, there's a question here which I'm going to ask you, which is this. It's coming from the audience, which says that, can you juggle book writing and your core research, at least in the initial drafts? Any advice for folks who have a day job and doing research, and how to strike the balance?
It just is hard. I mean, that you have to find what the balance is that feels comfortable, and just bear in mind that even if you don't do much on, let's say, a book, over time it adds up. And so just try and reserve, you know, a little bit of time, and don't feel that it's hopeless, even if it's only, as I say, like a couple of hours a week. You know, over time things start to accumulate, things start to aggregate, and that makes a bit of a difference in choosing your topic, mind you, because, you know, some topics are very, very timely. You want to write about it now, maybe not in 2 years, but certainly for me, and I think for most people who are active researchers as well, we tend to want to write about what we're doing, and so maybe the time scale for that is a little bit more flexible. Just the other thing that I must say I found super helpful when writing is getting other people to read what you've written, and getting your friends, getting your family, getting your colleagues to read what you've written and really tell you what they think of it. It's writing a book, even though they often have just one name on the cover, is never an endeavor just by one person. Certainly it wasn't for me. It's been kind of a collective effort in many ways.
And Vijay, a question for you, which is this: are you writing a book currently? Or are you going to write a book soon?
You know, I've been thinking of writing a book for decades and have not done anything about it at all. But I think now is the time, and I'm really inspired by Angela and Anil, and I'll get down to it. But as Anil said, if I write something, it'll be something which emanates from the work we do in the lab.
Nice. And lastly, I think that all that we have time for is a question that just come in, which is this: how do you keep your biases out of what you write? And I think that somebody addressed this point earlier, saying that we all have our political biases otherwise, but the important thing is to keep them out. How do you do that consciously? Shall we start with you, Anil, on this?
I think, again, having other readers on it can be very useful here, because they can perhaps see biases coming through that you might not. It's impossible to avoid, and in fact, you might not want to avoid it completely, because, in a sense, when you're writing a book, you're giving people your opinion rather than trying to be some maximally objective map of the territory. So it's something to be wary of. See if you can figure out what assumptions you're making, but I don't think you can extinguish bias completely from any kind of writing, let alone writing from more general, nor should you.
There's, if I may comment, there's a really nice review which Anil wrote on, I think it was in Nature Genetics, on consciousness and the different theories of consciousness. And that's a really good example of how different theories were given their due weightage, analyzed, but very politely but clearly, those which were a bit off on the left field were pointed out to be so. So you have, the author puts time and effort into see what are the strengths of contrasting theories, and then comes up with their opinion also, so that you're being fair, but you also have your own view coming in.
And Angela, my question to you, Angela, and thank you, Professor Vijay Raghavan. My question to you, Angela, on this is: how do you write a book on race without having a bias?
Everyone has a bias. You kind of just have to wear that on your sleeve, that tell your reader that you come from a particular point of view, your own experience, and don't try to hide it, because it matters to the reader who they're reading and, your own experiences and how that shapes how you look at the world. But at the same time, I do try very hard to, whoever I'm interviewing, and I've interviewed white supremacists, I've interviewed some of the most deeply misogynistic right-wing activists ever. And what I never approach those interviews or write those interviews up as, look how terrible this person is. What I want to do is understand, why do you believe what you believe, in the same way that the reasons I believe what I believe come from a particular point of view and a particular set of experiences. I don't think anyone is born hating other people. These are things that come from somewhere that, are developed by the societies that we're in and our experiences. And what really intrigues me is, why do people think what they do? And sometimes very serious scientists I interview, who can have really weird perspectives on the world outside their research, things that other people find deeply objectionable. And I just find that very interesting. Why is it that you can be very good at this thing and then hold these hugely marginal views about something else? That fascinates me as a journalist. We have to remember that science itself, everywhere, all over the world, is affected by the societies that we're in. The demographics reflect that. And actually, I'm just going to give a plug now to Lab Hopping by Ashima Dogra and Nandita Jairaj, which had just come out. I wrote the forward for it because I loved it so much. And this is an account of women, transgender and non-binary scientists in India and their experiences. And what you can see quite clearly in a book like this is that people do face abuse, harassment, discrimination trying to be scientists all over the world. And in India, there are particular sets of circumstances and particular life stories. But we have to think about that as well when we're writing. You can't treat research as separate from that, because those experiences inform the kind of work that people then do.
In fact, that very nicely answers a question by Ranjit Sharma, which says that aren't we also encouraged to write books that beautifully connect spirituality, culture, economy, and science without it being hardcore evidence-based, data-based stuff? I think the data and the evidence will come in, but it can be all that he's talking about as well. I mean, for example, lab hopping. It is all of that. You would not find that in any evidence-based science, but those are human stories.
Yeah, and science is a human thing.
Yeah.
So it's very important to include those human stories. And I think that's a direction that science writing and science publishing all over the world is going towards, is to include those human stories.
Just to amplify that, I mean, that's one of the joys for me. That was one of the joys of writing the book. Was it was an opportunity to put that human element back in, where it's often not in the academic paper, to bring out the everyday relevance, to make these connections across disciplines, to arts, to literature, that would get edited out of any scientific review paper. So that for me was really rewarding, and I think it does make, I think it reflects back onto the science eventually as well, because it makes you think about what the personal, the everyday, the societal relevance of what you're doing is.
Fantastic. And I think that entire thing has brought us to the end of this conversation, which is a beautiful conversation. And I think that the takeaway is science is intrinsically human. It's about our imagination, about our power to see, our power to connect. And under all the numbers and under all the hard facts, we shouldn't lose sight of the beauty that it describes. Thank you all, a lovely panel, a lovely conversation, and thank you for a lovely audience for staying on for so long. Thank you.